Hello, welcome to the barn. My name is Joanne Knight. Today we're going to talk about row 8 and row 9 of my Pay It Forward quilt. We're almost to the bottom of this quilt and we're going to discuss the decisions that I made and some of the techniques that I used for these two particular rows. If I go to my row 8 quilt group, you're going to see that this is what the quilting looked like on that particular row. Remember, I used these curved crosshatch patterns by Joyce Lundergan to be able to place in those really large grayish black triangles. This was actually a little plaid fabric that I used. So those went in these big triangles right here. I also put them in the white triangles that went around the center of the quilt, and so that's why you're going to see those a little bit back to back. This first block that's up was by Bo Herman. That particular block was really small in the center of it. Remember what I told you, that these blocks were only 9-inch finish. So even though the quilt ended up 99 by 99, the blocks were smaller. This is the pattern that I used in the background of this block. I wanted to do some kind of fill background, but I didn't want it to be something that was just straight lines or radiating lines or something like that. I wanted it to have a little bit more definition to it and a little bit more personality. So I did stitch in the ditch around the pink areas of the block, and then I drew an outside boundary of the seam lines. I also did stitch in the ditch around each one of these blocks, so I could do my stitch in the ditch and then convert that draw line to a boundary. Then it was just a matter of doing a boundary for the inside edge of the pattern. I used this pattern right here by Sharon Perry of New Zealand. Because I did a boundary of the center, it managed to cut off all of those purls. And you remember, one of the characteristics of fill, to be a good fill pattern, is something that quilts to the center and back out again. I'm going to change this to a fill outside because I only have one boundary, and I'm going to tell Creative Studio to fill that. If I were to do a virtual stitch out on this particular block right here, then what you would see is that this particular pattern is designed to stitch into the inside and back out again, and that makes it a perfect fill pattern, even though it's not necessarily intended to be that way. Just because it had that on point purls in the center of it to be kind of like a frame pattern doesn't mean that I have to use it for that particular instance. So this worked really well in that block. And then it was just a matter of doing straight lines, and they were a little straighter than this looks right here, and then putting some little purls in between them to be able to fill up that area. The next block that I did was by Faye LeClaire, and it was a reverse applique block. I understand that this is tons and tons of patterns, but once again, it was my quilt, and so I wanted to spend the time to do that on this particular quilt. Each of these patterns that I used for that particular block had to all be placed individual. Whenever I'm doing that, I'm going to do the stitch in the ditch around the outside. Then I typically do the background area first and then work my way into the inside area. Because if I do that, I'm not trapping fabric between an inside pattern and an outside pattern, so I have a tendency to get less pleats that way. This one took a little time because I did do individual patterns to place them in there, but it just seemed to work, and it really did a good job of enhancing that reverse applique that she did on that quilt. This next block shows you some open areas on the computer screen, and that's because I dropped the belts on this one, and did freehand in these areas that you see that are white. It was a really busy block, and I just wanted something that would do texture back there. And I wanted to be able to say that I had done freehand on my quilt. All of these patterns that you see right here are point-to-point patterns, so it wasn't really difficult to put those in there and make them stand up and really enhance the block. And because I did the straight lines in the larger triangles and the little pearls in the smaller triangles, and then brought the pearls into the center, it kind of carried the theme, and I was able to break up some of the pearls with these straight lines of these other triangles and these geometric lines. So that's as hard as that block was. And this is what I did on row 8. So now we're going to go to row 9. Row 9 of the quilt shows you some of the background quilting that I did in the large white areas. If you look back at the picture of the quilt, you remember that I did a round robin of these white areas, so it looked like the patterns were moving from inside to outside. And that was just a matter of making sure that the texture in the background white areas kind of matched the density of the quilting in the larger areas. This block was made by Lois Drell, and when you look at it, it looks like it is really, really difficult, but it's not. These corner patterns were designed by Nancy Hackey, and they're called Chained Melody, and that was nothing more than taking that pattern and placing it up in those corners, and Creative Studio did the stitching for me. Then what I did was take its pattern that matched it and put it in the triangle, because you see it's the same shape, but I needed the same density. So I just drew a boundary and put this in the triangles and did a fill inside, and that was able to give me that really cool background texture in this block. Then I used patterns that again had the little pearls on them, but they kind of broke up the block and just made it look like a really hard block to do when it wasn't at all that difficult. The next block that I'm going to talk about is this one right here, and this is Pam Clark's block. It was a really beautiful block, and what I did on this one, besides stare at it for a really long time, I decided I wanted this plaid to be in the large red areas, so I chose the pattern, and it's actually a border corner pattern by Tammy Oberlin. It's this pattern right here, and I know that doesn't look at all like the picture did, but when you take that pattern and you turn that pattern on a 45, it was a really good way for me to get some plaid, and I was able to do a fill and just let Creative Studio do that for me. When I did that, it gave me a lot of interest on it to be able to place these other patterns. There was just a lot of fill and a lot of manipulating, and being able to say, okay, where do I need a break in the pattern? Where do I need to back off of the pearls? And where do I need to put in a little bit more line work to have a little bit more geometrics there? So that is row 8 and row 9 of my Pay It Forward quilt. Thank you.